Welcome to Sam's Table. I'm your host, Sam Black, and today I want to introduce people to how I think about cEDH and what I think you would need to know to play cEDH if you're coming from a background in other Magic formats and don't have a lot of experience with multiplayer or the metagame in cEDH. So let's get to it. The biggest difference, in my opinion, between multiplayer and one-on-one kind of centers on this idea that exchanging resources with another player is fundamentally negative. In a one-on-one game, if you trade a cheaper card for a more expensive card, or if you trade a card for another card and draw a card out of it, then you're up on mana or you're up on cards, and that gives you an advantage in the game. You now have spent fewer resources or gained more resources than your opponent. But in a multiplayer game, when you trade up on mana with another card, the loser of that exchange is the person whose card you answered in a mana efficient way, because they spent the most mana and lost a card. But the winner of the exchange isn't you. The winner is the two other players at the table that watched two other players spend cards and resources to fail to accomplish anything for themselves. So, in general, playing removal is on its face setting you up for failure, because you have a card that is committed to putting you behind the rest of the table on average in an exchange. So if you play a very strong card like Swords to Plowshares that is a versatile answer that's very good at trading up on mana, that card on its face will almost always put you in a worse position than just casting your own proactive card. And this dynamic makes it very difficult to play reactive strategies and to play a lot of answers. And it also kind of just fundamentally changes how card evaluation works in the game compared to in one-on-one. Despite this fact, cEDH is remarkably interaction heavy. Players generally play a lot of cards that trade one for one with an opposing card. And understanding why that happens is important to understanding how to use those cards. Fundamentally, you need to have interaction in order to have any agency. If you don't have any interaction, the other players at the table can kind of just do whatever they want, and you don't have a say in any of it. But if you do have interaction, then you do have a say in what happens. And you can use that, you can have a say without spending your interaction through threat of spending your interaction. So if someone is going to, let's say at a very basic level, in a way that actually doesn't come up all that much in cEDH, but does kind of explain the point, if someone has a creature and they're going to attack an opponent, and it doesn't really matter which opponent they attack, they're just trying to reduce their opponent's life total collectively. If you have a removal spell, you could say, hey, if your creature attacks me, I'm going to kill it, so your creature should probably attack somebody else. And there's a good chance that it's all the same to them, and so they'll simply attack another player, and you can hold on to your removal spell. And that's good for them because they kept their creature, and now you still have this removal spell, and you've established that you're not interested in killing their creature. So now maybe you'll kill somebody else's creature, and that exchange will be good for them. So it's beneficial for both players here to play differently without spending any resources because you have this removal spell. So now this card has cost you no mana and no cards, and it's effectively gained you some life and done some damage to another player. There are a lot of other ways that fundamental concept comes up, but that's a big part of the value of interaction. Another big part of the value of interaction is sometimes an opponent will attempt to win the game before you do, and if nobody has something to stop them, the game will end and you'll lose. So it's good to be able to not lose, to give yourself a chance to win. Also, if you attempt to win and somebody does something to stop you, if you can answer their answer, you might be able to win despite the fact that somebody had a card to stop you. And so there are certain moments in the game that are much more high leverage and impactful than other moments in the game. For example, when somebody's trying to win, countering a spell might have a much bigger impact on the outcome of the game than countering some random card that someone's playing to put themselves in a slightly stronger position. In a lot of cases, you want to try to be comfortable with your opponents putting themselves in a stronger position, because that might force other players to take them down a peg to stop them from winning. And if you can just be patient and let somebody else be threatening and not use interaction that you have, another player might get nervous before you and might use their interaction so you won't have to. And that creates kind of this game of chicken about not using your interaction, because using interaction is so bad for you. Not only are you making this negative exchange with the table where you go down a card, but you're also losing a resource that you could be using for residual returns via threat of activation, right? That Swords to Plowshares that I threatened somebody with to make them attack somebody else. If later I have to cast that, now other people can attack me without fear of reprisal, because the Swords to Plowshares is no longer in my hand. I can no longer show them that I have it and that I'll cast it. So it's really important when you interact, and often specifically to interact as late as possible in a way that's very different from most, especially contemporary one-on-one formats, where all the threats are so good and many of them generate value over time, such that interacting earlier is generally a lot more efficient and effective. Commander or multiplayer really flips that around and makes you think really differently about using your interaction. So that really just changes the way the game is played in a really big way. So it's important to know, and I hope that's been adequately covered. So the next thing I want to talk about is the idea of timing your wins. In one-on-one games, in general, when you have the ability to attempt to win a game, you should do that, because then your opponent has less time to draw interaction, and it's less likely that your opponent will do something to win the game first. In multiplayer, going fast isn't always best, because at the beginning of the game, everyone has a bunch of cards, and sometimes the total number of cards in people's hands will be going down over time. There are other times when that's not the case. This is largely a function of cards like Rhystic Study that draw an enormous number of cards. I guess as an aside, I would like to try to stay focused, but I'm me. There are gonna be some tangents. The concept of big games versus small games is very important in multiplayer because the games sometimes take really different textures, and what it means for a game to be big in cEDH is kind of a unique thing compared to what it means for a game to be big in most one-on-one situations. Specifically, there are a lot of cards that draw cards when things happen that are heavily played in competitive Commander. Most notably, Rhystic Study, Mystic Remora, Esper Sentinel, and like Fairy Mastermind. And in a different way, Smothering Tithe, which makes treasures rather than drawing cards, but leads to really high resource games. What happens is when multiple people get these cards in play, then they feed each other, where someone will cast a spell, that'll make somebody else draw a card, that will give them another spell to cast, so they'll cast it, that'll make the other person draw a card, and they just go back and forth. And now whenever they use cards, collectively they're not going down on cards, just more cards keep flowing. And you can sometimes get into these game states where players will have 20 or more cards in their hand because everybody's deck is full of free cards and everyone's drawing multiple cards whenever anybody does something. And the games where those cards are in play have a very different dynamic than the games where nobody has one of those or only one person has one of those, and they don't snowball the same way. Maybe a single person has a Rhystic and the rest of the table can afford to pay for it. Maybe someone plays one of those things and it's countered. Maybe another one's played and it's destroyed. And then you reach the stage of the game after setup where people don't have big card draw engines, and then people have to play with kind of finite resources in a way where in a lot of the games you're not really playing with finite resources. And it's important to understand whether you're playing a big game or a small game in terms of getting back to what I was talking about, figuring out when to attempt to win. Because if there isn't this snowballing cards in hand big game dynamic, then once the few pieces of interaction that people have early are used up, people will often just not be able to do anything about anything that happens. And so the first time in a small resource game, in a game without one of these engines, the first time a scary thing resolves and the table doesn't really no one hesitates, nobody acts like they could do something about it. Maybe your read's off. Maybe someone knows that they're very conservative about when they're going to interact. But often you can just get a sense that the table is out of things, and if you can present a win, you'll just get it. So it's important to be able to read how much interaction is at the table based on how people are talking, what things they're letting resolve, so that you can figure out, okay, is this a time, if I try to win right now, if I play this combo that's in my hand, can somebody stop me or will it work? And in the big game, so in the small games, you can kind of wait it out, let somebody else try to win to pull out the interaction, then go yourself. In the bigger games, that can happen, but it's much harder and weirder because when somebody tries to win, everybody's getting more cards. However, if they're really trying to win, then what happens is the people who are getting these cards are using all their free interaction. And so even though they have giant hands, their hands will often be lands and sorcery speed spells if they've been fighting over something a lot. So you kind of need to track both how many cards people have and how much of the free interaction that's typically played they've already used to try to get a sense of what's left. But if you try to win, into all these card draw engines and you have to feed them a bunch in order to present your win, then even if all the interaction had been pulled out, you'll give people more interaction. So in these really high resource games, trying to win gets really, really complicated, especially because the way the format works, many players play cards that let them cast their spells at instant speed, like Born Upon a Wind. And so if somebody has mana and a card draw engine, and you try to win, what will often happen is that instead of trying to stop you, they'll wait for the rest of the table to use all their interaction to try to stop you, and then they'll try to win in response. So that's going to happen a lot more in the really high resource games than it is going to happen in the low resource games. But I guess without spiraling too much on getting really deep into the nuances here, the point that I'm making is very often the first person to try to win, if you present a win on turn 3 or something, you're usually going to get stopped. And then the player after you is pretty likely to win before you get another turn after you get stopped. And so there are times when your best chance is just to go as fast as you can and hope that people didn't prioritize interaction in their opening hand, and you can just, sneak out a win on turn 1 or 2. But a lot of the time, when you have the ability to present a win, if you don't have good ways to protect it or back it up, it's better to just wait and try to find a more secure moment, or a moment where the table is less likely to have interaction for you. But you do want to be really careful about, assessing how close everybody else appears to be to presenting their own win, to make sure that it's safe for you to give everybody else a turn before you try to win. And if you're new to the format, it can be kind of hard to know when somebody is close to presenting a win. But, if you do decide to get into it and you find yourself like looking at the table and thinking, oh, I could win, but is anybody else going to win if I pass the turn, and you're not sure what their decks do, you can just ask, because the other players at the table are going to want you to be afraid of the players who aren't them. So if you ask the table in general, hey, does it look like anyone's close to winning? Everyone's going to try to explain to you how the other players are very threatening. And so then you can listen to the case they're making about how far the other players appear to them to be from winning, and use that information to decide how much pressure you're under. So the next thing I want to talk about is kind of the archetypes and strategies that exist in cEDH, because a lot of the ways that a lot of the language that we have to use to talk about archetypes and strategies in one-on-one Magic don't really apply or aren't really relevant. Like the idea of the beatdown or aggro decks or inevitability or control, all of those barely apply at best. Just the basics, just like what kinds of decks there are and how strategy works, are really fundamentally different. So what you have to understand is that combat matters very little and life totals matter very little, because while in a format Commander has a very large card pool, and there are a lot of cards that were printed for Commander that are creatures that are really good at dealing a lot of damage. But you have 3 opponents, and they each have 40 life. So in order to win by dealing damage, you need to deal 120 damage instead of 20 damage, and that's just enough more that it's not realistic. there are steps you can take to make it more realistic, like the fact that you are damaging 3 different opponents means that if you have things that damage each opponent, they're 3 times as effective as as damaging a single opponent would be in one-on-one. But it's still just an enormous amount of damage to need to deal with like creatures that have power. And so it's just not really a relevant part of anyone's plan. There are games where someone ends up like dying because their life total is depleted. It's usually a single player, and it's usually because everybody else is attacking them. And even more often, it's because they paid a lot of life to do something and then got low enough that killing them with 2 power creatures looked realistic. But because the amount of damage you would need to deal to win a game is so high, nobody really cares about how much power any creature has because that's not a number that helps you win a game. And so the other players are very unlikely to contribute a meaningful amount of damage if your strategy does involve dealing damage. So there are creature decks, but there are creature decks and there are fast decks, but there aren't beatdown decks in the sense of my plan is to win via combat. Essentially, every deck is a combo deck. Even if you are trying to win by damage, you have to deal so much damage that you kind of need some kind of combo or a thing that's like a combo to make that happen. Something that lets your damage get exponential or something like that. Again, that isn't a common strategy. But not so everyone's playing combo decks, but what kind of combo you're playing is very different. Like Storm combo has a very different feel than Thassa's Oracle Demonic Consultation, where with Storm combo maybe no single spell matters that much, and you're just trying to cast a ton of spells in one turn. Whereas with Thassa's Oracle combo, you're trying to cast 2 spells in one turn, and each of them matters a lot. They both have to resolve for you to win. Then there are other, like, on-board combos, like Kinnan Bonder Prodigy and Basalt Monolith, where if you have both of them, you have infinite colorless mana, and then you just need something to do with that infinite colorless mana. So there are a lot of different ways that combos happen. Sometimes there are combos with a commander that lead to kind of, this 1-card combo, almost like Kinnan is often a commander. Basalt Monolith means that, if you just have your commander, there's this 1 card in your deck where if you find it, you have it in your commander, you have infinite mana. Then it kind of becomes a 2-card combo because you need something to do with the mana. But there are a lot of different cards that work there. So basically everybody's playing a combo deck. The aggro decks are combo decks, the control decks are combo decks, and by that I mean the decks that have a lot of creatures and maybe care about combat are combo decks. The decks that are very spell-based are combo decks. The decks that have a bunch of creatures that don't care about combat are combo decks. It's just all players trying to assemble their combos. But again, they're going to play out in very different ways. And sometimes the Rule of Law, or Arcane Laboratory, or Archon of Emeria, or Deafening Silence, these cards that stop a player from casting multiple spells in a turn, are extremely impactful because everyone's playing combo decks, everyone's drawing tons of cards. They place a very, very big restriction on the game that makes it very difficult for most decks to win. The decks that play those cards, which are typically referred to as stacks decks, will still use combos to win. They will just use combos in ways that don't involve casting multiple spells in a turn. So, with that understood, that all of the relevant strategies and concepts are different, I want to talk about some of the things that you can think of them as archetypes, you can think of them as just ways to discuss aspects of decks, just some concepts that I think are useful in discussing the strategies in cEDH. Turbo. This kind of replaces aggro, and it's just the decks that try to win the fastest. The decks that can sometimes present wins on turn 1, often on turn 2, generally by turn 3, if nobody's interacting with them. These decks generally don't play a lot of interaction themselves, and or they're kind of fragile. Like they'll play a bunch of ritual effects, and then if their payoff is countered, because their mana was all single use, they haven't developed, and they've like spent multiple cards, and if you stop whatever payoff, it might take them quite a while to rebuild. Stacks, I talked about. That's decks that play a meaningful number of permanents that disrupt other people's ability to advance their own game plans. There are a lot of different kinds of stacks effects. There are stacks that limit how many spells people can play, things that stop some kinds of cards from working, like Null Rod or Cursed Totem. Trinisphere is like a different take on limits abilities to cast spells. In general, these cards are not very widely played because everyone has answers to them, and so you basically slow people down, but generally don't stop them from setting up. And then at some point, someone will just use like a bounce spell or removal spell on your stacks piece that was stopping them from winning, and then win. And so it's generally safer to try to end the game than to try to lock people out of the game, because these cards are never that hard to answer. But before they're answered, there are a lot of cards that can really stop most decks from functioning very well. The issue is, if you play something like a Blood Moon, that might make it impossible for 1 or 2 players at the table to play spells. Someone who had a very good start involving some artifacts that tap for mana might be able to completely ignore your Blood Moon and take advantage of the fact that you've removed the other players from the game, and then beat you pretty easily because you invested a bunch of mana in this card that stopped other people and not them. And your deck is probably not the fastest because you're playing these cards that are trying to slow other people down. So you risk this issue where you play a stacks piece that eliminates some of the table but maybe doesn't affect 1 or 2 people at the table, and then that just creates an easy opportunity for them to win. So stacks are present and impactful, but generally not considered a strong core strategy for the most part. Another concept that I think is somewhat underrated, that I care about more than most people in deck designing for this format, is what I think of as resilience, which is the ability to attempt to win and then have someone successfully stop you, but then to be able to attempt to win again. Or the ability to play against some kind of stacks piece or play through some kind of interaction where, bad stuff can happen to you, but your deck is designed in such a way that you can still advance through that. Value, which is kind of similar to card advantage, and generally just like a meaningful concept in Magic that still applies here. I think it was just kind of like generating more resources than your opponents over time. The card draw engines that I mentioned, like Rhystic Study, are generally the best value generating cards. And these cards are very strong. I think the format in many ways revolves around value generation more than it revolves around like turbo. Like the winner is more often the person who gets the best value generation down rather than the person who draws the cards that allow them to try to win the game the fastest. Another concept that I don't really have a pithy name for is being difficult to interact with. Specifically, this usually comes in the form of winning in some way that doesn't involve casting spells that can be countered. A lot of the interaction in the format is in the form of counterspells because they're versatile and often free and can interact with the stack where a lot of the most important cards to winning take place. Also, the fact that they are very good at either stopping other people from winning or protecting your own wins makes them particularly good as interaction to play. So being able to win in a way that counterspells can't interact with is a very strong feature for a deck to have. So a deck like Magda, Brazen Outlaw, the dwarf that makes treasures when dwarves become tapped, that will generally win by activating Magda's ability to put artifacts from your library onto the battlefield and trying to keep Magda off the battlefield with counterspells is not a very realistic strategy because it's a 2-mana commander. Generally, people play fewer counterspells that counter creatures than can counter non-creatures because of cards like Force of Negation. And so, yeah, just being able to win outside of the stack is, or well, outside of spells on the stack, I should say, is something that is the strength of some decks. Another way to get this is white cards that either make your spells uncounterable, well, less of that in white. More, make it so that your opponent can't cast spells. So cards like Voice of Victory and Grand Abolisher and Silence, if you have those things in your deck, especially if you have ways to make them uncounterable, like Cavern of Souls, then you can make your deck difficult to interact with no matter what you're trying to win with, because the first thing you do is something that cuts off future interaction, and then you try to present a win after that. So there are a number of ways to get at hard to interact with, and it's something that is very highly prioritized and very important in the format. Flexibility / flash. I mentioned earlier that Born Upon a Wind and similar effects are very important to being able to try to win in response to somebody else trying to win, or to generally break the natural turn order. That if the most important thing in winning a game after a certain point is timing when you try to win correctly, you're very limited in the flexibility that you have in timing that if you can only try to win on your turn. So if you have something that lets you win at instant speed, now instead of which turn cycle do I try to win on, you get to decide exactly which spell do I want to try to win in response to, which is just so much more fine-tuning. That's really powerful and important to have access to. So I think of that as like flexibility or flash is another big draw to some decks. Another concept is the idea of drawing heat, which is bad. That's kind of how scary you look, how much other people are afraid of you and therefore inclined to try to stop you. If a deck has to have requires more buildup, especially buildup in a face-up way. So if you need permanents on the battlefield that tell your opponents how close you are to winning, that would make you threatening in a way that would draw heat, where now you're more likely to be involved in the resource exchanges at the table, which is always going to disadvantage you. So when evaluating a deck, if its play pattern is such that you have to develop in a way that's going to draw heat, draw attention, draw interaction, that to me would be a drawback to that strategy. It's best if you can avoid that. So the opposite of that would be sneakiness or concealment, the ability to win out of nowhere and to not look threatening first so that other players are underestimating you or not interacting with you. That's not an exhaustive list of like relevant strategic concepts for multiplayer, but I think that gives you a good idea of some of a lot of the dynamics, and it's just those are the things that I thought of to talk about. Next, I wanted to touch on some of the most played decks, and then the key cards and play patterns. First, the most played decks. The most played deck is Tymna Crom, which is called Blue Farm for some reason. Tymna and Crom. Tymna is white-black and Crom is blue-red. They have partner. Both of them draw cards. So this is a 4-color deck without green, and its primary strengths are that it's good at generating value. It's good at having like flash and flexibility because it plays some of that like instant speed enabling cards. It's also decent at being hard to interact with because it plays the silence effects and the white creatures that stop other people from interacting. And then it can also be pretty good at turbo and pretty good at concealment because it plays relatively compact wins. Thassa's Oracle, Demonic Consultation, or Underworld Breach. And those don't necessarily require that you have a ton of cards, and they don't necessarily take a lot of setup. So sometimes you'll have hands where you don't look very threatening because you have very few cards, but the few cards that you have happen to be, say, Cavern of Souls, Grand Abolisher, Thassa's Oracle, Demonic Consultation, and you can just play an uncounterable Grand Abolisher and then cast Thassa's Oracle, Demonic Consultation, and win the game in a way that's super hard to interact with. So that would be a set of cards that's not necessarily likely to have without a lot of tutoring. And if you have to do the tutoring, then people will, like if you tutor for a card and you don't immediately play it, a lot of the time that a deck like this would tutor for a card, they would be tutoring for a value engine. They would be looking for Mystic Remora or Mystic Study or some way to get a bunch of cards. If you see someone playing a deck like this and they cast a tutor and then they don't immediately deploy a value engine, it means that they were instead setting up a win. So that means they're either finding protection or they're finding the other half of the combo. So you want to take into account how much people have tutored when assessing how likely they are to win, especially if it's become apparent from the play pattern that the thing that they found wasn't mana or card draw. Because if it's not one of those, it basically has to be trying to set up a win. And the next deck that I want to talk about is Kinnan. Primary strengths there, value. It has card draw engines plus Kinnan itself lets you spend mana to get stuff, and Kinnan itself represents multiple mana because it's doubling the mana generated by a bunch of your other cards. So it's kind of like mana plus card advantage in a way in the command zone. Also, it's green and most of its mana is in the form of permanents rather than like rituals. In general, green decks are very good at resilience because of the fact that their mana is permanent and they have the ability to get cards back from their graveyard with green cards. So I think Kinnan is pretty good at value, pretty good at resilience, decently hard to interact with due to Kinnan's activated ability, has some amount of concealment due to the random nature of the activated ability, but also a decent amount of drawing heat due to the fact that the deck is a lot of permanence, and it's the way that its mana works has to be on the battlefield and coming from permanence. And so while people might not know exactly how threatening Kinnan's going to be because they don't know how lucky you're going to get on like what creature you put into play, they still know how many times you're going to get to activate it, how much mana you have to work with. Tymna Thrasios This is another 4-color Tymna deck. This one has green instead of red. The primary strengths of this are value and resilience and a little bit of hard to interact with because of white. This deck is generally slower than Tymna. The green cards don't contribute as much to winning quickly as the red cards do, but more of its mana is going to be permanent, and so it's going to gain a bit in resilience. It's going to have to commit less to its wins. It can kind of test the waters with some combo that might win the game if it sticks, and then get stopped, but still have like more other backup plans. Next, Rograk Thrasios. This is my primary deck. This deck is good at value, resilience, and being hard to interact with. It's a green deck that is very, very good at making mana. Like, I think it's better than all the other decks at making mana. And because of Thrasios, that mana becomes extra cards. And none of its no single card outside of Gaia's Cradle really matters all that much individually. You just kind of make a lot of mana and put that into drawing cards, and then have a lot of different ways to turn those cards into more mana, more cards, and eventually win with something. cEDH, this is a 5-color deck with a commander that can search your library for legendary things and put them into play. This is very hard to interact with because you win with activated abilities just using cEDH. It has a good amount of flexibility in the like flash speed sense because cEDH can be activated at instant speed. You're basically just kind of trying to develop mana, and then you can often just like pass with the cEDH activation and either find interaction or win in response to something. And then how sneaky it is really depends on your opponent's familiarity with the deck. Sometimes people don't know what conditions you need in order to present a win, and sometimes they do. And so that might factor in heavily to like how face up your win is in terms of like whether you function more like a deck that draws a lot of heat or more like a sneaky deck. Magda is kind of weirdly similar to cEDH, weird in that it's a 1-color deck versus a 5-color deck, but both of them are like pretty hard to interact with, pretty good at winning at instant speed, and mostly rely on permanence. Magda, I think, typically plays like a little bit more of a stacks game than cEDH does. And then the last key deck that I want to talk about is Rograk Silas, or Rogsai. This is a turbo deck that has a good amount of value because you're often using your black tutors to find the blue card draw engines, and then some amount of flash where like Born Upon a Wind and Valley Flood Color are important cards in the deck. This deck is much worse at value in that you don't have card advantage in the command zone in a meaningful way. So you really need to stick one of those engines. And if you play Heuristic Study and it gets countered, then you don't have. So I guess you have value but not resilience, in that you're good at presenting a value piece that will then give you a lot of cards to work with. And if you stick that, the deck is really good at winning because you have like a lot of rituals and you're very good at converting cards in hand into an immediate win. But if you can't stick a value piece early, then you can really just run out of having anything to do, and a lot of the time you're just like drawing mana and you're not drawing very, very many cards, and so it can really struggle with its lack of resilience. But in exchange, you're very good at finding the value engines and can present wins on the second turn not infrequently. Some key cards and play patterns. I've already talked a decent amount about Rhystic Study and Mystic Remora, but they're arguably the defining cards in the format. Underworld Breach is, I think, kind of the like strongest compact win. It's very cheap and not very difficult to get a situation where if it resolves, you win. Basically, if there's a single tutor in your graveyard and you have a bit of mana or you have some cards in your graveyard, you use your tutor to find a thing that gives you mana. You use the thing that gives you mana to cast the tutor again to find a thing that gives you more cards in your graveyard, usually either Brain Freeze or Grinding Station, and then you win. So it can be hard to win super fast with, just because you might not have the cards in your graveyard to spend. But once you've gotten past the very early game, it's like a super cheap card. And once you've resolved it, you now have access to the counter spells in your graveyard, plus the tutors in your graveyard, plus the mana in your graveyard. And generally, once it's resolved, it's kind of too late for the table to do anything about it. Thassa's Oracle is the other really clean, compact, cheap win. This requires a 2-card combo with something to exile your library, but with Demonic Consultation specifically, that's 3 total mana and only 2 cards, and very absolute in terms of you just win the game. It's well known, and again, if either spell gets countered, it doesn't work. But because it takes so few deck slots, it's often what decks that draw a bunch of cards and have silence effects will finish with. Next, silence effects, anything that makes things uncounterable or prevents other players from casting spells on your turn, or also silence, as in casting silence on somebody else's turn to stop them from winning, is also very impactful. But just in general, getting any moment when other people can't stop you from doing what you're trying to do will almost always lead to a win. Free counter spells and deflecting SWAT are kind of what the game is about. Everybody has a lot of free counter spells, and you really need your interaction in this format to be free or extremely cheap, because you can't hold up mana, because then you're developing slowly, and given that your plan is to try to avoid ever casting your counter spells because you want to have your interaction just to be a threat, if you're putting yourself down on mana to hold up interaction and then you're not spending the mana, you're not using it profitably, or you feel compelled to use it to counter something, now you're not getting that's a one-on-one play pattern, right? Where you just decide, okay, I'm holding up a counter spell this turn, I'm going to stop whatever my opponent does to make it to the next turn. Stopping whatever a single player does in a multiplayer game doesn't guarantee that you get to the next turn. There's not a control plan that you could be advancing in that way. You need your mana to be advancing your own game plan, so you need all of your counter spells to be free or 1 mana. Mana Drain is a card that sees fringe play, despite being an extremely powerful card, because reactive spells that cost mana come at such a high cost in terms of your own development to have access to that mana. Boseiju and Otawara, the channel lands, are extremely significant because they allow interaction without casting a spell. So they are, if somebody has used a silence effect to try to win the game with permanence, then Boseiju and Otawara are the best ways to be able to interact when they didn't expect other players to be able to interact. Born Upon a Wind and similar really changed the dynamic around timing wins in a very significant way. If it's your turn and you cast a silence effect to try to win the game, then sometimes you will be thwarted because someone will counter your silence effect. Other times, you might just force somebody else to win first. So, just a significant aspect of the format is the fact that kind of effect is fairly heavily played. And then the last notable thing I want to talk about is copy effects. Because there are so many objects in a 4-player game, it's more likely that a card that copies something is going to have something good to copy. And so clone effects are more common and more relevant. And if you're going to play some kind of really big, powerful thing, you need to understand that there's a decent chance that you doing that will give other people access to it for much less mana than you spent on it. Those are what stood out to me as some of the key cards that impact how the game is played. The next really important thing to understand before playing cEDH is priority. It's really important to have a nuanced understanding of the rules around priority. There's a dynamic in cEDH that people refer to as priority bullying, which can be viewed negatively, people use that term because they view it negatively. And so the term exists to convey negativity toward this thing. I personally don't really view it that way. I think that understanding how priority works and what that implies is table stakes to playing. It's just what you need to understand how the game is supposed to work and whose responsibility it is to act when and what kind of political leverage exists. And also just knowing the rules is just important because the precise details of timing comes up a lot more in a 4-player game where it gets a little bit more complicated. Given that, I'm going to assume that there's a decent chance that many listeners don't have a perfect understanding of how priority actually works in the game. It's not that the rules are different in multiplayer. It's that Magic is played with shortcuts that mean that the exact details don't matter very much a lot of the time. So the way that priority works is when the active player, on an empty stack, the active player has priority. They get to do something. When they do something, they put an effect on the stack. They retain priority until they choose to pass priority. This is seen on Arena when you go into full control. Arena assumes by default that whenever you do anything, you wish to pass priority because in general, when you do something, you want it to resolve before you do something else. But technically, a player keeps priority and can put as many things on the stack as they want until they pass priority. But of course, you have to pass priority before anything can resolve. When you pass priority, which is still presumed to happen whenever you do anything, but you can always say, I'm going to do this and hold priority and also do this. In general, though, when someone does something, they pass priority. Now priority goes to the person to their left, the next person in turn order. They have the same rules. When they put a thing on the stack, they can choose to put another thing on the stack or not put another thing on the stack. Or if they have priority, they can simply pass priority and not put anything on the stack. Regardless of whether they put something on the stack, priority then goes to the next person in turn order. So if it's my turn, I'm player 1. The person who is player 2, if they put a thing on the stack on top of something that I put on the stack, the next person who gets to do something isn't me as player 1. If you're only used to 2-player, then I do something, my opponent does something, now it would be my turn again. It's not my turn yet. Priority goes to player 3, then to player 4, then back to player 1. Whenever a player has priority, they can either put something on the stack or pass priority. Whenever every player passes priority, the top item of the stack resolves. It is possible to neither put something on the stack nor pass priority without acting, which is to say that if you take an action that doesn't use the stack, such as tapping a land, you have not passed without action, and you have not put something on the stack, But the fact that you have done something means that you have reset priority in the sense that now everybody has to acknowledge the new game state and pass priority before the top item of the stack resolves. Why this is significant is if player 1 casts an important spell, player 2 passes, player 3 passes, it goes to player 4. If player 4 passes, the spell will resolve. Player 1 has already passed when they passed priority after finishing their actions. So that was the first pass, then 2, 3, and now if 4 passes, that's all 4. If 4 doesn't have any action and communicates, hey, you guys didn't do anything, I can't do anything here, are we sure we want to let this resolve? Like if I give one of you guys priority back, can you do something? If a player says, okay, yes, I can do something, then player 4 could take any game action at all, including tapping a land, and then the top of the stack won't resolve until players 1, 2, and 3 pass priority again. So that allows resetting priority. So if I'm player 3, I can priority bully by passing priority to player 4 rather than acting. And then maybe after I pass, I could say, okay, yeah, actually I have something, give priority back to me. So that dynamic around how resetting priority works matters a lot, especially because everybody's always inclined not to act. So if we imagine the situation where player 1 is casting a spell that everybody knows is going to win the game. Let's say they have an empty library and they're casting Thassa's Oracle. If player 2 and player 3 both have counterspells, and let's say they both suspect but don't know that the other person has a counterspell, player 2 is incentivized to immediately pass priority. They don't want to give any indication that they have a counterspell. They would like to make somebody else have to deal with this. Player 3 now has to decide if they think player 4 has something, or if they think they can talk player 2 into doing something, or if they think they need to deal with it themselves. And they could try to have a discussion, they could cast their counterspell, they could pass priority. Those are basically the three options. If they pass, it would go to player 4. In this situation, now, if player 4 passes priority, the game ends. If we assume that no one's going to be able to stop the Thassa's Oracle trigger, there are 2 counterspells, they're the only interaction points that are available. In this situation, where both players could cast their counterspell, neither one did. If 4 passes, everybody has lost the game of chicken, and the Thassa's Oracle player will win. Hopefully, the player who is fourth to act will have a conversation with the table. They'll say, I can't do anything about this. I'm willing to show people my hand to prove that I can't do anything about this. I would prefer not to pass priority and let this resolve. I can take a game action to reset priority. Can anybody do anything? At this point, maybe one of the other players fesses up and says, okay, yeah, I can do something. Or maybe not, and maybe player 4 just does something to reset priority and hope. And then let's say priority gets back to player 2. Now player 2 could say to player 3, okay, I have a counterspell. You know that I have a counterspell now because I've told you, but unless you show me your hand to prove that you don't have a counterspell, I'm going to pass priority. And if you do something to give priority back to me, I'm just going to keep passing to you. And we're either going to lose or you're going to have to counter it yourself unless you prove to me that you can't, and then I will. I think that this is a relatively strong strategy for the person in seat 2 to take to avoid losing the game and avoid needing to be the person to interact. So the person in seat 3 then kind of has to be the person to counter it because they can't prove that they don't have a counterspell, because they do, and they can't pass priority because they'll lose. However, if player 2 is in a much stronger position than the person who's player 3, and player 3 believes that they can't win if they use their counterspell, they're like, if I counter this, you're just going to win. So it doesn't help me, so I'm not going to. Now, they've put it back to player 2 to decide if their best chance is to call player 3's bluff or just to counter it themselves. And so there's a lot of play to the discussion around who's going to have to interact and the politics around it. But the way that conversation has to unfold should be informed by understanding the rules of priority and who ultimately has the power to force what actions within the game rules. So obviously there's a lot of depth to how those politics play out, but that's most of what I wanted to say about like what priority bullying is and how that plays out. The game is extremely political. There's no getting around that. There are some players I know who I've seen play cEDH who say they don't like politics and they don't want to like get into like making deals or whatever. And that's fine as a preference to have. I think I'm not sure if you feel that way, that this is the best format for you to be playing in terms of your own enjoyment, but different players will approach the political aspect of the game very differently, but it's very, very difficult to opt out of it entirely. I once tried playing a game with some friends where we just played, all right, nobody's allowed to discuss the game at all. And the game ended when a player tried to win, and I had Candelabra of Tanos, and I could have untapped another player's lands, but I had no way of knowing that the other player had the ability to stop them if I gave them some mana. And so we just lost. And in a normal game of cEDH, no like deal has to be made. There's not like a big element of trust or anything. Player 1 would present a win. Player 2 would say, hey, you have a way to give me mana. If you do that, I can stop this. Otherwise, I can't stop it. And then player 3 would say, well, I don't want to lose, and I do want you to use your card to stop this. Here's some mana. And that doesn't require a lot of trust, because it's just everybody acting in their immediate self-interest. And so there's no real like deal. There's just a statement of fact about like what will happen just naturally based on everyone acting purely self-interestedly. Similarly, with threats, like if you attack me, it will be in my interest to kill your creature. If you don't attack me, it won't be in your interest to kill my creature. Again, that doesn't require a lot of trust. That doesn't require any real agreements. It's just like a statement about the game state. There are other situations where people will make explicit deals. Hey, if I attack you with Ragavan so that I can get a treasure and a card, if you don't block on your turn, I'll let you attack me with your Ragavan so you can have a treasure and a card. Because currently Ragavan doesn't have any good attacks for either of us. And if we make this agreement, then we both get more resources. Players will often offer agreements like that, and players will often accept agreements like that. When they do, those agreements are not officially binding within the rules. The second player, either player could choose to block the Ragavan if they wanted, but a vast majority of the time, those agreements are honored because the cost of removing one's credibility by breaking this pretty small deal early in the game is much greater than the benefit of being able to continue to make beneficial agreements throughout the rest of the game. That's much more true if you take a long-term iterated approach to the metagame of making deals, where you might be playing games with the same players over and over. And if you're known as someone who honors your agreements, you will have a lot more ability to get involved in future agreements than if you're known as someone who doesn't honor those agreements. So there are a lot of different aspects to politics. I can't cover all of it, certainly not in kind of an overview of the format episode, but it's almost the most important thing in the format. People joke about this thing called the YAP meta, which is just, everyone talks a lot. There's a lot of like people convincing each other, helping each other out with threat evaluation, convincing other people that their opponents are more threatening than they are, to encourage other players to use removal or interaction in ways that benefit the players who are yapping. And a lot of the conversation is necessary in terms of necessary as in like the situation I described with the candelabra, where like if we don't have this conversation, we're going to lose a game that we don't need to lose. And a lot of it is more kind of like almost opportunistic, might be a way to put it. Like, I might as well try to talk somebody into this thing because it would be good for me if they believed it, even if I don't necessarily know that it's or think that it's in their best interest. I think that I've covered enough of that. So I'm going to wrap this episode up here. I do want to end with a little postscript. This episode is the first episode of my podcast. Welcome. I hope you enjoyed it. There will be more to follow. This is going to be somewhat unique in terms of a scope or topic, since it's like an introduction to the kinds of things I'm going to be talking about. In the future, I expect to do more. Here are some ideas about decks or cards or discussions with other players, but I felt like this was an important thing to do first specifically. Also, I did intend to start this podcast quite a while ago. I found it a lot more daunting to record than I originally expected. I'm pretty happy with how recording this today felt and optimistic about my ability to get this going. I do want this podcast to have a little bit more room to openly discuss my own experiences and preferences and biases. And so in the spirit of, hey, this podcast is a little bit more about me rather than just about strategy compared to Drafting Archetypes, my previous podcast, I just wanted to comment a little bit on my personal experience and that I've like struggled a little bit with getting this up, but that I hope to be able to keep it up at a pretty clean cadence. So hello, welcome, thanks for listening, and I will be back with another episode soon.